So this YouTube video aims to improve your understanding of general proprioception. Special proprioception is the vestibular apparatus, and that's covered separately. So what is general proprioception? This is the sense of knowing where your limb, body and head is in space, both when stationary, so sitting, lying, standing, and during movement, which we refer to as kinesthesia. And this proprioceptive information ascends to the cerebrum, which is referred to as conscious proprioception, and the cerebellum, which in the purpose of this YouTube video is referred to as subconscious proprioception. Now we say conscious for the cerebrum, but actually you are not conscious of it. The adjustments to your body are made without you being aware of it. But it's referred to as conscious proprioception because of that destination in the sensory cortex, and it gives the brain an awareness of limb and body position without actually having seen the limb, allows the animal to regulate their posture and their movement, which is essential for planning movements and also for learning more complex movements. And a lesion in the conscious proprioceptive pathway will result in a loss of proprioceptive positioning reaction, which is where you turn the foot upside down and you expect the animal to correct that abnormal foot position. Subconscious proprioception, on the other hand, is ascending to the cerebellum, and it allows the cerebellum to coordinate that movement, again, without you having to think which joint is being moved, which joint is being extended or flexed. And this is essential to synchronize movement and maintain equilibrium, and a lesion in this system will result in a loss of smooth coordination of muscle movement. Now, proprioception is sensed by proprioceptors, and these are mechanoreceptors specialized for proprioception. And there's four main types. The first is the muscle spindles, and these are most important for subconscious proprioception. These are in the skeletal muscles, and they're sensitive to an increase in muscle length, and also sensitive to an increase in muscle firing rate. So they give that low down information on the muscle straight up to the cerebellum, which will then coordinate that muscle activity. Also is the Golgi tendon organs, which are in the tendons, again important for subconscious proprioception, and they respond to increased muscle tension, so muscle contraction, and again allow that feedback to the cerebellum to coordinate that movement. The Pacinian corpuscles are on the joint capsules and tendons, and they are most important for conscious proprioception, and they detect joint movement, both dynamic joint movement, the direction of that joint movement, and the speed of that joint movement. By contrast, the Ruffini's corpuscles, also on the joint capsules and tendons, give information about static position of the joints, so that they provide information about where that body is in space without the animal actually having to be moving that joint. And obviously that's very important for when you're remaining stationary, and this is also important for conscious proprioception. So the anatomy of conscious proprioception is illustrated here. So we have the receptors. They go through the dorsal horn and dorsal nerve root ganglion then into the dorsal horn, at a variable position for the pelvic limbs. This is in the T1 to L4 region. This doesn't happen for the pelvic limbs. They sign up straight into the brainstem, into the nucleus cuneatus. That information ascends to the brainstem and then decussates, and then ascends up to the thalamus and then on to the somatosensory cortex. And the main pathways for carrying information about the conscious proprioception are at the top of the spinal cord, which is why lesions at the dorsal part of the spinal cord are more likely to affect conscious proprioception. Or likewise, if you've got something large under the spinal cord pressing it up against the wall of the canal, then again, conscious proprioception is going to be affected. The sort of deficits that you have from conscious proprioception, the most easily recognizable one is a failure to place your joints correctly, especially the distal joints, and this is assessed by the proprioceptive positioning test. So when the dorsal surface of the foot is placed to the floor and the weight is fully supported, the animal should immediately adjust to a normal position. The reason why you need to take the weight fully is that if the animal is weak, then that may delay the animal's ability to lift that paw, and also some animals that may have some other severe deficits may not be able to coordinate that standing action as well, and I'm going to show you an example of that later. So conscious proprioception ascends to the cerebrum, which is why we call it conscious, but you're not conscious of it. Gives you an awareness of the limb and body position without having to look at that limb. Allows you to regulate your posture and movement, essential for planning and learning. And the most important proprioceptors are the Pacinian corpuscles and the Ruffini corpuscles, which are on the joints. It decussates at the medulla, so below the level of medulla, then the deficits will be ipsilateral to the lesion. So this is a dog with a right-sided conscious proprioceptive deficit. You can see the knuckling here due to a right-sided cervical spinal cord lesion. By contrast, this dog has a right-sided forebrain lesion, but it has a left-sided conscious proprioceptive deficit. So what does the gait look like when you have a conscious proprioceptive deficit? Well, actually, because conscious proprioception starts at the receptors and goes all the way up to the brain, how an animal will look will depend on how the rest of the nervous system is affected as well. So, for example, an animal with a spinal cord lesion will also have some weakness. However, in very rare instances, you can just affect conscious proprioception without affecting anything else, and this gives us a very good idea of what the gait would look like with just this deficit. So here we have an example here, and this is a border collie with an inherited sensory neuropathy. Now, it does affect other sensations as time goes on, but at this stage the dog just has a conscious proprioceptive deficit and also has absent nociception. And you can see with this dog that he frequently falls, and that joint placement in the pelvic limbs, the thoracic limbs are currently normal, is very poor. So when they're not placed completely underneath the limb properly, that's when the dog is likely to fall. But because this is a sensory neuropathy, the dog actually doesn't have any weakness. So we can just really appreciate that this gait is entirely due to a sensory deficit in this instance. So the role of the cerebellum is to receive information from a number of sources, including proprioception, and to coordinate that. So the subconscious proprioceptive information originates from the proprioceptors, as said before, of which the most important are the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs, and these ascend again through the dorsal nerve root ganglia. For the pelvic limbs, relays again in the nucleus thoracicus, which is T1 to L4, whereas the thoracic limb again relays into the brainstem nuclei, and then that goes into the cerebellum. The cerebellum also receives proprioceptive information via the spinal livery tract, which ascends to the livery nucleus. We call that the cerebellar livery and pontine system. The pontine nuclei are also receiving that information, which then goes up into the cerebellum, and it's also getting feedback from the motor cortex, and that circuit helps to very fine-tune movement. So a subconscious proprioceptive deficit results in problems with coordination of movement, because the subconscious proprioception coordinates that movement without you having to think about which joint is extended or flexed. It's essential to synchronize movement and maintain equilibrium, and a lesion will result in a loss of that smooth coordination of muscle movement. So for example, if you went to pick up something, you would direct your hand towards that object. For example, suppose it was a cup of tea. You would then adjust how you were picking up the cup based on the weight of that object and bring it succinctly to your lips to drink that delicious cup of tea. If the cerebellum wasn't working properly, then you would overshoot in many directions, giving you a tremor, and you might slop the tea because of your inability to judge how to pick up the cup and how to adjust your muscles for the amount of weight that was there. Most cerebellar lesions will result in other cerebellar signs, and again, like the ataxia that we saw with the border collie, it's unusual to find a lesion that just involves those tracks and nothing else. However, there are some inherited spinocerebellar ataxias that do look like that, at least in the early stage, and this is one of those. This is the Jack Russell Terrier inherited spinocerebellar ataxia, and we can see here this subconscious proprioceptive deficit. So we see the kind of truncal sway, which is often referred to as titubation. You can see that the movements are more exaggerated than normal. There is increased muscle tone. He's poorly coordinated. Tends to have a bigger sway than normal. The limbs tend to be more further reaching forward than before. So it's just a general loss of fine control of that muscle action. However, this dog is not weak, and there are no conscious proprioceptive deficits. So how do you assess proprioception? Well, the most important thing, at least for me, is assessment of the gait. And I do maintain that if there is a dog, it is better to take them outside and walk them up and down and then round in a circle. You get a much better impression of their gait than you ever will in a small consulting room. And it's by far worth taking that time and effort, because you'll gain more information from the gait than you may do from the rest of the neurological exam. And these still photos are from a Great Dane that has a cervical spinal cord lesion and demonstrates much of a proprioceptive, which is also called a sensory ataxia. Proprioceptive ataxia is the most correct term, and some people refer to this as a spinal ataxia, because the most common proprioceptive ataxia that you'll see will be spinal cord disease. However, as I intimated with the border collie, you could get a proprioceptive ataxia because of a sensory neuropathy, and you also could get one from brainstem or cerebral disease, theoretically, because conscious proprioception ascends to those regions. So with a proprioceptive ataxia, you'll have a truncal sway, abnormal stance, a tendency to circumabduct the limbs widely, crossing limbs when walking but failing to cross the limbs when they're turning, and variable paw placement of paws. So for example, in this dog we can see that this paw here is dragged under him very briefly as he's walking. We can see that there. Here we can see that there is a wide-based stance as the dog is turning, and this hypermetric action, increased movement in the protraction phase, but with increased joint extension rather than the increased joint flexion that you can see in cerebellar disease. And if you want to learn more about that particular aspect of gait, then I recommend my other video, which is on making sense of dysmetria. Also with a proprioceptive ataxia, we can see this is the dog trying to turn, and we see this wide-based stance instead of crossing the limbs. Again, we can see this example of hypermetria, which we get with spinal cord disease, with increased joint extension, and the failure to cross his legs when he's turning. how do you assess proprioception? Well, for conscious proprioception, the most useful test is the positioning test, sometimes called the paw replacement test. And in this, we fully support the weight of the animal, turn the foot to the floor, turn the dorsal surface of the foot to the floor with the weight fully supported, and the dog should immediately adjust to a normal position. So you can see here that I've got my hand under the dog's sternum and the belly and completely supporting their weight, flipping the foot over, and she immediately corrects that foot position. The other tests that are particularly useful are hopping and hemiwalking, especially in species other than dogs. Most cats have to lose an awful lot of proprioception before they will allow you to turn their paw and not just pick it up. I find hopping and hemiwalking much more useful for that species. So you can see here it's just a suggestion of a proprioceptive deficit in this cat, but he rapidly corrects the foot, and it's quite difficult to do this. You can see the normal forelimbs here. So these hopping and hemiwalking are part of the postural reactions. Here you can see this is part of a neurological exam sheet. This is downloadable from my website at neurovet.co.uk. And so we move next on to hemiwalking and hopping. And we can see quite a hypermetric action again of this pelvic limb, suggesting there may be some upper motor neuron damage. And you can see the knuckling of that paw that we felt had a proprioceptive deficit in. And of the other pelvic limb, so it's a bilateral problem. Moving on to hopping. So in hopping, as soon as the joint is no longer in alignment, then the animal should instantly correct it. As is normal for these thoracic limbs. And look how it's delayed in these pelvic limbs, which for me is really confirming that this cat has a conscious proprioceptive deficit. And that it's worse on the right than it is on the left. Now, if you didn't need convincing that these are useful tests, then look at this puppy here with inherited cerebellar disease, neuronal ceroidal epiphysionosis. You can see the severe tremor, and this puppy is so severely affected that they're unable to coordinate movements to stand and to walk. And you can only assess the postural reactions by fully supporting the weight. And when you do that, so we can see here, you can see actually, despite the fact they can't walk or stand, that hopping response is actually surprisingly good. It's a little bit exaggerated, and there's increased muscle tone, and that's because of the subconscious proprioceptive deficit and the effect of cerebellum on muscle tone. Just see there how the forelimb is hypermetric and a bit spastic. But the correction of the foot position is pretty normal, and we see there's no knuckling there. So this dog doesn't have any deficits of conscious proprioception despite having severe cerebellar deficits. The other test that I wanted to go through at this stage is touch, because it's included in that neurological exam sheet as I showed you. And the test for this is tactile placing, where you cover the eyes, and when the limb is brought into contact with the examining table, they should immediately place their foot on the table. And the reason why this is often included at this stage is because the tracts which contain the conscious proprioception also can contain touch. So that's the fasciculus gracilis, which is touch from the caudal trunk, and the pelvic region is up in the dorsal funiculus, along with the fasciculus cunatus, which is touch and conscious proprioception from the cervical region. Conscious proprioception otherwise is going up from the pelvic limbs in the spinomedullary tract, which is ascending with the spinocerebellar tract for subconscious proprioception. The trouble with tactile placing is that, one, you can't do it on a larger animal because, well, for me, I can't physically lift them, and two, they don't like their eyes being covered. So this is an example of that test not being enjoyed by an otherwise very docile cat. And you can see I didn't really gain very much. The first part of that was visual placing. The cat could see the table coming towards it, and tactile placing. You can see how friendly this cat is normally, just not something that he enjoyed doing. So it is not always a test that many neurologists do. So that was proprioception for the body. Most textbooks completely ignore proprioception in the head, but that is very important. And most of that is mediated by the trigeminal nerve. And there are four important receptors to talk about. There is more than this, but these are some of the most important ones. First of all, the muscle spindles and the masticatory muscle, and they provide crucial feedback for coordinating jaw movements. And then we have the extraocular muscles, which are very important for helping to coordinate eye and head movements. And then we have the cutaneous mechanoreceptors, such as Menace's corpuscles and Ruffini endings, that are in the face. Then we have the periodontal ligament receptors, which are monitoring the forces in chewing and biting. And the somewhat unusual thing about proprioception for the trigeminal nerve is that there isn't a cell body in the dorsal nerve root. There isn't a cell body in the trigeminal ganglion, in other words. The cell bodies for proprioception are actually within the brainstem, the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and that is said to facilitate rapid processing. So, in conclusion, proprioception is the body's ability to sense its own position and spatial orientation and movement without having to look at that body part. And in fact, people with sensory neuropathies often do look at their body part to help move it because they're trying to make up for that deficit. And occasionally you can see some animals doing that. They have specialized receptors, the muscle spindles, golden tendon organs, and other mechanoreceptors, and those are in the muscles, tendons, and the joints. These receptors continuously send information to the cerebellum and the cerebrum, and this helps to coordinate your balance, posture, and your precise movements. And assessing proprioception accurately is a very vital part of the neurological examination. Thank you.